Canadian identity has been influenced in many ways by events in the past. This project will shed light onto the 5 most significant events in creating the Canadian identity we know today. April 1917, the birth of a nation. Canadian soldiers far and wide had strived to take on the hardest territory challenge yet, Vimy Ridge. Located in northern France, this German soldier-occupied area had stayed undefeated and held off both French and British Allied attacks for 3 years. However, there was one more attack they wouldn't expect. A small British colony by the name of Canada had decided they wanted to prove themselves too. Debatably, the Battle of Vimy Ridge is one of the most historically and significant World War I battles that would shape the Canadian identity as we know it. This attack would introduce some of the heaviest artillery used in the war and had all 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps working together. Along with this, there are 100,000 fighting soldiers, 10,600 casualties, months of training, and for the first time, a use of maps that would be given out to soldiers to provide direction and plans for attack. Canada had taken its first step to glory after defeating the Ridge and taking their victories in only 3 days, compared to 3 years. Shaping our Canadian identity, this event provided us with the opportunity to grow and brought a voice to the people for what they were as fighters and as people, not just for being a small shadow of the large British Empire. With great courage and success, Vimy Ridge was a defining and unforgettable moment for the nation. Without it, Canada might have not had such a formidable popularity boost, and this country could be a much different place than we are used to, potentially putting a stop to more defining Canadian moments in the future. This event was the first in terms of significance, it was the birth of a nation, and it was the first step to being recognized. The Cold War era was less than smooth sailing and had many repercussions with other countries. However, after World War II, Canada realized that being a bystander was the last action they could take. Their size meant that they could help others and voice their opinions on issues that were happening around the world. From 1945 to 1969, Canada's foreign policy brought new ideas to the table that would be used for many years to come. In the event of Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson, his incredible creations and acts had to be acknowledged as they helped shape the Canadian identity. Lester B. Pearson was a Canadian who proposed multiple ideas and took a stance to make our world a better place with the United Nations, a group that Canada served 6 times on a Security Council. Pearson took it into his own hands to introduce many new and permanent agencies that would be used today. These agencies are the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and the United Nations International Emergency Fund. These 3 organizations that were created at the time have held a big part in our modern society and helped shape our Canadian identity in the eyes of kindness and assistance. For example, when the infamous coronavirus hit, the World Health Organization got straight to work, using their determination to keep others safe by providing strategic and preparedness plans, response plans, and increasing the momentum for others to receive vaccines for COVID-19. On top of that, Pearson created the principles of peacekeeping. Pearson won a Nobel Peace Prize for the world's first large-scale United Nations peacekeeping force to de-escalate the Suez Crisis in 1956, an event that could have divided the United States and Great Britain, 2 allies who worked together in the Second World War. However, many of the issues which prompted these agencies to be created, such as sickness and hunger, still exist today and are going to be an issue which we will have to deal with for quite some time. Though Pearson did take great steps and created change, as well as adopting the idea that Canada would be a peacekeeping country filled with helpfulness and amity, the Cold War era and its events in general gave Canada the opportunity to step up and build a name for itself in positivity. With the previously mentioned acts created by Pearson, that's what Canada did. Though the nation was far from perfect, it was a start. The Great Depression was a time within the economy during the 1930s that negatively affected a number of people, their family, and their businesses. In 1929, the stock market reached its peak, then crashed. Prices began to take a nosedive as panic selling began on Black Tuesday. Investors struggled as margin calls were made and they couldn't pay up. Businesses began to shut down and suicide rates rose extremely high as people struggled to cope with the high stresses of the dirty 30s. The over-farming led to the depletion of good soils on prairies, and overproduction resulted in the unemployment and closing of factories. Survivors of the Great Depression are still alive today. 91-year-old John Papa Cronk and 90-year-old Frances Nana Tyndale, interviewed by Bridget Maston to get the full stories of their experiences during the Depression. John was born in 1931 and grew up with his mother and father on Hamilton Mountain during the Depression. However, he wasn't quite aware of it. As said by Cronk, "You know how people say, 'I grew up poor, but I didn't know it'? Well, that's exactly what it is. I remember my mom giving me a penny and it was a big deal. My dad was making 15 cents an hour at Stelco." When it came to the cost of living, Cronk only had handmade knit clothes from his mother. He had to get his groceries off a cardboard box on the ground on Barton Street, and all of his toys were handmade. He claims one lesson today that people should take from the Depression is to share and make true friendships. Those were prime qualities that came with living during that time. He claims, "Friends were real friends during those days. Everyone was in the same boat. There was no being friends with someone because of what they could give you. Friends were friends because they were people." Now, an interview with Frances Tyndale to get her experiences.
We moved from Niagara Falls to Gananoque, which is near Kingston. It's a small town. And I still remember to this day that we were eating bread with mold on it one time because I guess they didn't have money for anything else. I remember that very clearly. I remember very clearly my grandfather putting a $10 bill in a pitcher up on our ice box. And that was the money to keep us in food for the week. The children were very depressed, and that wasn't uncommon. Everybody wore secondhand clothes. Everybody passed them on from their brothers and sisters. Now, you would have had to wear Ryan's clothes, but most people couldn't afford to go shopping. The radio was extremely important to people because it was the only way that they could keep in touch with what was going on. You had to know where people were at and who was moving where and who was going to have to join the army and whether they were being fed or not.
What lessons did you learn from the Depression that you think people today should take from?
I guess the fact that you had to look after the other people around you. The thing that we did do, we were very generous with what we had to share it with the people around us that didn't have. With people not being able to eat and men having to go especially from the East Coast to the West, hoping to get some jobs on the farms, what they called hobos. They passed the messages on to each other. If somebody had gone by that way and knew that when they came into Gananoque, if they went to the third house on the street with the white veranda, that lady would give them some sandwiches. So we had men lining up at our door every day when I was a little girl.
Juno Beach was a code name for one of the 5 beaches in Nazi-occupied France that was involved with the famous Normandy landings, otherwise known as D-Day, in June 1944 during World War II. Originally, the cause of D-Day landings happened in order to regain control of France that had been taken over by Germany and exploited for resources. If this attack was successful, German resources and military sites in the area would be blocked, and the Allies could finally have a foothold in Northern Europe. This invasion took lots of planning in order to succeed. The consequences of these landings overall had a massive turn of events for the Germans, forcing the tide to turn against them and abandon their control over the area. In addition to these consequences, D-Day also resulted in the Allied liberation of Western Europe from Nazi Germany. The Normandy landings were known as the beginning of the end when it came to war in Europe, as it ended just the following spring after the attack. Not only was it a major turning point in the war, but it was also the world's largest amphibious military assault in the history of warfare. In terms of the development of Canadian identity, Juno Beach was an invasion which the assigned Canadian involvement and attack was crucial. The Canadian training for the invasion had begun as early as 1943. 14,000 Canadians fought, including the Canadian Army's 3rd Infantry Division and the 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade. While they were fighting on land, the Royal Canadian Air Force patrolled and attacked from above, whilst the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion dropped down from the sky. Their fierce attitude and determination drove their success, though they paid a high price. There were 380 lives lost on D-Day alone and 2,400 Canadian casualties. By the end of the Battle of Normandy, there were 18,000 Canadian casualties and 5,000 lives lost. Eventually, Canadians successfully captured their shoreline positions on Juno Beach and penetrated the farthest inland of any of the some of 155,000 Allied troops who landed on June 6, 1944. The reason D-Day and Juno Beach was so significant to Canada was the legacy it left behind. Vimy Ridge, otherwise known as the birth of a nation, was the first time Canada would start to be recognized, but the victory of Juno Beach allowed the country to finally establish itself in the real world as a powerful force to be reckoned with that helped to end the war. It solidified Canada's place in the world and therefore showed what they were really made of. Once World War II had hit, the Pearl Harbor incident meant an unexpected and harmful change was coming for the large numbers of Japanese Canadians that would impact generations to come. Japanese Canadians, thought to be spies for the enemy country of World War II, which had just ended, were forced into ghost towns with a great lack of amenities and had to register that they were Japanese. Furthermore, they were forced to wear symbols to let others know of their race and had to be transported in boxcars and trains, just like the Holocaust, a tragic event that happened between 1939 and 1945. Once it had been reported that Japanese Canadians had done nothing wrong, they were paid $21,000 in reparations, though it wasn't very much. It is hard to comprehend what exactly Japanese Canadians were feeling at that moment, but it is not up for debate that they felt bewildered, betrayed, and angry. Their home, where they were supposed to feel safe, had been seized, and everything they knew had to be left behind. The reparations weren't nearly enough to live, and it seemed as though the world was against them. Muriel Kitagawa, a mother from Japanese descent, had many feelings about the event, saying, "The bitterness, the anguish is complete. You, who deal in lifeless figures, files, and statistics, could never measure the depth of hurt and outrage dealt to those of us who love this land. It is because we are Canadians that we protest the violation of our birthright." Meanwhile, while the Japanese Canadians were struggling, everybody else in the country acted as though it was what had to be done. By seizing their boats and treating them like animals, they were controlled in a way similar in terms of the Holocaust, until they were proven innocent. Now, looking back at the damage that has been done, we can recognize our mistakes. Now, we realize how discriminatory acts cannot be stood for, and now we realize and devote time to finding ways that can make up for the racism and the unfair treatment. This event shows us how Canadian identity has changed in a big way. We made harmful mistakes that were unforgettable by the families affected, mistakes that may even be unforgivable. However, we stand tall as Canadians, and we take effort to heal those mistakes the best that we can. Though it is part of our past, we cannot forget the ways in which our country has acted. But it shows the growth that we can acknowledge this event and help the best that we can to create a better and more inclusive, more kind place. As you can see, the Canadian identity has changed greatly over time, and if it wasn't for these events, everything could be different today. Now, people can acknowledge what has been done in the past to help us shape our future for the better.